He's moving around.
Robert may have been muted. Robert, if I'll unmute you, hang on. There you
That's
go.
okay. No, that's okay. That's okay.
All right.
How's everybody doing? All safe and happy? Reasonably happy?
Yeah.
Good, good.
If anybody feels homebound, they can always take a long drive on an interstate highway.
Yeah, I've done that. I've done that, you know, and try to find something at a midway point, you know, and say, what can we do? But
So that
anyway.
just makes me feel happy to be homebound after I've done that.
It's true, it's true. Let's see, everybody. There may be a few more that come in, but you can let them in, Stephen, right?
Yes, I will put them in automatically.
And I want to thank Stephen Breeden up on the top of the screen.
Hi, guys.
He is a member, been a member. He is the one that gave me the idea of having a Zoom meeting. So because he did that, he has responsibility for this meeting. I refer all issues anyone has to him, but he's making it possible for us. And I'm really excited to have Paul Coggins with us tonight. As we've spoken to us a few years ago, when the Mueller investigation was really getting started. Your advice being that Trump should not say anything, and you know we know how that happened.
Yeah. He doesn't follow lawyers' advice very well.
Not at all, right?
Yeah.
But now he's got a lawyer he really, really likes
Yeah.
in his corner. And I was just Googling today, and I found this Committee for Responsible Ethics in Government, and how they just recently brought a bill, introduced. They want to impeach him. They want to impeach him for numerous reasons, and it was very interesting because. And the reason I wanted Paul to speak, because as I've been watching Bill Barr, it just seems like he provides so much shade to Donald Trump. He makes everything possible for him to do. He just covers him and offers legal justification. And but Paul, as a former U.S. attorney, has probably a much better sense of the impact of his actions on the attorneys that make up the Justice Department. So I wanted him to talk about Bill Barr and the attorney's experience as he sees it. And then you'll have time for questions. Okay?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Mary
Oh,
Claire.
before I forget, Paul, just one thing. I wanted to remind you, he's sitting in front of bookcases that have copies of his newest book,
Exactly.
Sting Like a Butterfly, and he is, it's his third book. The other one is The Lady is a Tiger. It's available on Amazon, and I just checked that. And this is also available on Amazon. So, and they're legal thrillers. So.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mary Claire. I always appreciate the plug. So that's why the books are back there. Let me talk out, and I'm going to talk very briefly about the structure of the Department of Justice and what's affected by what's going on in DC and what's not. There are 94 U.S. attorneys, and I was in the Clinton administration. In fact, for the entire 8 years of the Clinton administration, I was the U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Texas, which encompassed about 100 counties. And all of those U.S. attorneys report to the Attorney General. And I'm currently the president of the National Association of Former U.S. Attorneys. And that's a very bipartisan group. We have about half Republicans, about half Democrats. Our board is equally comprised of R's and D's. And they always make me, when I give these talks, say, I'm stating my individual opinions and not the opinions of the National Association of Former U.S. Attorneys. For us to give a public statement, we have to have 3/4 of the board vote in favor of it, which is a pretty tough hill to climb. But anyway, what hasn't really been impacted much by what's going on in DC is the day-to-day work in the field. In other words, among those 94 U.S. attorneys, and you have to understand this, in the U.S. attorney's offices, which can vary from being quite small, maybe 6 or 7 assistant U.S. attorneys in Muskogee, Oklahoma, to quite large. Los Angeles and New York, Southern District of New York, they probably have 250, 300 prosecutors in those offices. My office, when I was U.S. attorney, had about 100 assistant U.S. attorneys, which sounds like a lot, but it really came out to be about 1 per county. that were based in Dallas and Fort Worth. So the day-to-day work of the U.S. attorneys kind of goes on, and the only person that leaves the office after an election is generally the U.S. attorney. All the assistants hold over. So you can see you have assistants that are lifers that have been there for a long time. What does not go on because of the political appointees in the District of Columbia now are a number of very important things. And I would say chief among those, especially now, as we get closer to the election, is the enforcement of voting rights. The Civil Rights Division, the enforcement of voter rights was considered a key part, a key function of the Department of Justice. There was a special group set up in the Civil Rights section, a special group that just enforced voting rights. And as you know, Congress allowed the Voting Rights Act to lapse. The Supreme Court struck it down. There is a bill that has been passed by the House to reimpose the Voting Rights Act, but Mitch McConnell has not brought it up to the city. Why is it important that we do not have a functioning voting rights group now? It's important because of the widespread voter suppression that went on in 2016, went on in 2018, and will go on in steroids this election. With states closing polling places, with states shortening the time for early voting, with states throwing people off the voting rolls. And remember this, whenever they talk about a close race or a state that, for example, Hillary lost by a whisker, you have to ask yourself, how many people got thrown off the voting rolls prior to that election? And in many of those cases, the number of people who were thrown off the voting rolls exceeds the margin she lost by. Wisconsin's an example of that. But you don't have to look very far to find voter suppression activity that in the past would not have passed muster, in the past would have sparked a lawsuit by the Department of Justice and now goes unchallenged. Here's an example. Florida, by an overwhelming majority, passed a referendum to restore the voting rights of felons after they had served their term. Help them reintegrate in society, give voting rights back to people who have done their time. What did the Republican governor and the Republican legislature do? In Florida, you have a fine for your court cost. Most inmates aren't making money in prison. Most inmates get out of money with no prison. So they passed a law that basically said, until you pay your fines off, you don't get your voting rights restored. Never would have gone unchecked by the Justice Department if there was a strong, active voting suppression. Some of the things that the Postal Service are doing now would have been challenged, should have been challenged by the Justice Department in the past. So that's the kind of activity that is not going on in DC and won't go on with the current Justice Department. Same with the threat of domestic terrorism. We are not meeting the threat of domestic terrorism because right-wing terrorist groups are not being labeled as such. They're not being enforced the way that so-called left-wing terrorism groups are. So if there's one message to get out of this, the most important thing Democrats can do if they retake the House, if they retake the White House, is, I believe, to pass the voting rights bill that is sitting in the Senate right now, restoring voting rights and restoring the special place of the Department of Justice to enforce those voting rights and to crack down on states that are trying to restrict the vote. The second thing that's not going on now, oversight by Congress. And why not? The House is trying, but when you have an administration that refuses to honor subpoenas, when you have an administration that refuses to investigate false statements to Congress, and most of all, when you have an administration that refuses to turn over tax returns to Congress, there is an explicit statute that allows a House committee to get the tax returns of anyone in the United States. It's not permissive, it's mandatory. If that committee wants to see your tax returns, it's entitled to see your tax returns. For the first time in history, the Secretary of Treasury and the Attorney General refused to turn over Trump's tax returns. And they made up an exception to this law. And the exception was, they said, if it wasn't being sought for a legislative purpose, we don't have to turn it over. That's nowhere in the statute. And that's when I knew we had a major problem, because the statute's clear. It was the job of the Attorney General, when the Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, refused to turn over those tax returns, to tell Secretary Mnuchin and President Trump, those tax returns have to be turned over to the House committee. That's the job of the Attorney General. And this Attorney General did just the opposite. He supported Mnuchin's made up exception to this law. So that's two areas that aren't being done now. One is the enforcement of voting rights. The second is effective oversight. Because if you don't have the Attorney General backing you up when you seek records, if you don't have the Attorney General backing you up when you subpoena witnesses, and if those witnesses make a false statement, you don't have the Attorney General backing you up and calling them on it, charging them with it, that is a crime. The other thing we don't have going on now is upholding the principle that no man is above the law. I don't need to go into too much detail. The last time, as Mary Claire pointed out, I spoke to y'all, it was sort of as we were going in to the Mueller report. And I don't purport to be a close friend of Robert Mueller. I've met him, have admired him. Many of the things he's done in his life are commendable. Here's a fellow who got, I think, approved by the Senate twice to be the head of the FBI, once 99-0 and once 100-0. That says something about someone's reputation. I will say this, I believe Director Mueller made two mistakes here that, well, maybe let's make it three mistakes. One, he was too deferential to the Trump team. Number two, he should have insisted on an interview with the President of the United States, as opposed to allowing the President's lawyers talk him into letting those lawyers give him written answers to questions. It should have been a face-to-face interview, and I think that was a mistake. And the third one, and perhaps this is not Mueller's fault, because remember, Mueller occupied a special position. He was not an independent counsel the way independent counsels in the past have been, such as Ken Starr. He was a creature of the Department of Justice. So because Jeff Sessions recused himself from the investigation, the Deputy Attorney General appointed Robert Mueller as maybe the only man in the country that both parties would accept. And Robert Mueller reported back to the Department of Justice. Well, because that was the route it went. In other words, Mueller wasn't truly independent. He reported through the Department of Justice, just like I would have when I was a U.S. attorney. When he finished his report, he turns it over to Bill Barr, and Mueller stays quiet for 2 weeks while the Attorney General mischaracterized that report, and mischaracterized it in very important ways by saying that it exonerated the president of collusion. When we finally read the report, it was clear it did no such thing. In fact, it said, if we could exonerate the president, we would do so. We are not able to do so. That doesn't sound like an exoneration to me. But as I said, I think Mueller should have interviewed the president, and sort of the last criticism I would have is he didn't finish the job. He was hired to determine if laws were broken and specifically if the president broke the law, his report is quite detailed. It leads you up to that conclusion. It does not state the conclusion. So I think he owed the American people his judgment on whether or not the laws were broken. And I think I know what that judgment would have been. But he didn't go there. He basically set out the facts and let you draw your conclusions. But because Mueller, being a creature of the Department of Justice and one who worked within the system, he let General Barr mischaracterize the thrust of that report for 2 weeks. And that was critical. I mean, I think that caused a lot of people's minds to think, well, there's no there there. There was a lot of there at the time. It's just that nobody was reporting it out to the public. And by the way, the recent report by the Senate committee actually goes further than the Mueller report and does conclude that President Trump was not honest in his written responses, even though he got to give written responses instead of face-to-face answers. And even though his lawyers crafted those responses, the Senate committee, dominated by Republicans, found that he was not truthful in those written responses. Now, I said that no person is above the law, and that principle is sacrosanct at the Department of Justice. It is clear that that principle is not being upheld here, and that is why people who are not just friends with President Trump, but people who could implicate President Trump are clearly given treatment like no defendant I've ever known has been treated. And the clearest example of that is Michael Flynn. The short answer with Michael Flynn is he either lied to agents or he perjured himself in court. There's no middle ground between those. He did one or the other. And guess what? Both of them are a crime. And for the Department of Justice to override career prosecutors and intervene in a case where somebody has stood up in front of court and under oath told the judge that he was guilty, that he's pleading guilty because he's guilty, that he's not pleading guilty from any duress, to intervene at that stage is something I've never seen in my experience, and I've been doing this 40 years. And I've talked to a lot of my fellow U.S. attorneys, and they said they've never seen anything like it either. And it was done, as I said, over the objection to the kind of career prosecutors I talked to you about earlier, the ones who do the day-to-day work, the ones who have, some of them have been there for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And the pretext on which it was done, that even if Flynn lied to the agents, the lie wasn't material to any investigation, makes no sense. It's a little bit too much inside baseball, but clearly the FBI had an interest in finding out if the Russians were trying to corrupt our election. That is what they were questioning Michael Flynn about, whether the Russians essentially had blackmail material on him because they'd known that he had actually lied to the agents. And for the Justice Department to argue that's not material to an investigation is frankly, it's almost laughable. But here again, you have to see that Flynn is someone who is in a position to implicate the President of the United States and his family and receives preferential treatment. Let's talk about a more recent example where the statements made by the Attorney General don't bear scrutiny. And that was the ham-handed attempt to remove the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. The Southern District of New York is probably the most famous U.S. Attorney's office in the country. It's if not, I think it's the second largest, second to Los Angeles, but it's got Wall Street. It's got all sorts of, you know, big name criminals that you read about all the time. And the U.S. attorney there was someone named Jeff Berman. And as you read, about a month ago, General Barr tried to get rid of Jeff Berman. Well, there were several of us scratching our head over that, because it's quite common when a new administration comes in for the 93 or 94 U.S. attorneys. I say 94 because one of them's for Guam and the Virgin Islands, to cycle out because they're presidential appointees. What's very uncommon would be for you to get rid of a U.S. attorney with only months left in a term. We've only got about 3 months left in this term. It makes no sense to get rid of a seasoned U.S. attorney now to bring someone new on board. It takes them 6 months to figure out where the bodies are buried. So you have to ask yourself, why would the Justice Department want to get rid of Jeff Berman? And we don't know the answer to that. But you know what we do know? We do know the Southern District of New York had an ongoing investigation of Paul Manafort. We suspect they have an ongoing investigation of Rudy Giuliani. And you have to ask yourself, when the history is written, the history books are written, did the attempt to get rid of Jeff Berman and put in a, you know, a more favorable prosecutor have anything to do with those ongoing investigations? We don't know the answer to that. I do know this. It makes no sense to get rid of a U.S. attorney this late in a term and stick somebody in there for a matter of months.
Can I ask, Paul, was Berman a Trump appointee?
Berman was appointed by the court. So the courts, if a U.S. attorney is not appointed, there's a procedure for the courts to make an appointment. And so he was sort of a long-term court appointment. I will say this, as you probably remember, there was this whole drama that went where the Department of Justice issued a press release saying Berman had resigned. Berman said, I didn't resign. He said, forget that Justice Department press release. I didn't resign. The president then fired him, which the president can do. But because it was done that way, the first assistant took over. So she is a career prosecutor. So there's a career prosecutor. And as you saw, Paul Manafort got picked up. He got arrested. So the work in the Southern District of New York goes forward, but it's going forward with someone who is not a Trump appointee.
I see.
Like I said, if I had the answer to that, once again, though, the pretext for getting rid of Berman was, well, we had this great guy who's head of the SEC, who, by the way, has no prosecutorial experience. We wanted to put him in to be the U.S. attorney. As I said, it just makes no sense that you would do that at the end of a term. Maybe at the beginning of a term, if you know, Trump were to win, you know, that might make sense, but not at the end of a term like this. Now, I mentioned ongoing investigations. In fact, in a potential investigation involving Rudy Giuliani. Carl Ginsburg will know this. There's a very fine trial lawyer who passed away recently named Steve Sussman. And Sussman's firm is Sussman and Godfrey, and he's a great trial lawyer. As I mentioned, he passed away a couple of months ago. And when he did, he's working on a book, which is unfinished. And I really hope somebody picks that book up and finishes it. Because what he was doing was examining attorneys who have sterling reputations and then spoil those reputations at the very end of their career and trying to find the answer. Why would someone who enjoys a great reputation risk it all or throw it all away in the twilight of their career? And two of the people he was spotlighting in the book were General Barr and Rudy Giuliani as people who enjoyed these reputations and then for whatever reason have been willing to throw them away.
He was from Houston, right?
What's that?
He was from Houston.
He was from Houston, absolutely.
I knew that a long time ago. I didn't know that he passed away.
Yeah, unfortunately he did. He had a bicycle accident, a very serious bicycle accident. And while he was recouping, he got COVID and just didn't make it. But, you know, when I think about why these people are, their reputations are suffering, it reminds me of when I was a very, very young lawyer. I got to know this judge, Judge Higginbotham, who's now on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And he used to tell young lawyers, and it's something I've taken with me my entire career, if you can't say no to your best client, you're in the wrong profession. And I think that is absolutely true. And I mentioned to you that when I knew there was going to be a problem with the Justice Department was when General Barr couldn't tell Mnuchin and Trump, you have to turn over your tax returns to this House committee. They're entitled to it statutorily. There's no exception. Do it. But just recently, like I said, the most recent thing, and I talked about voting rights, is not only is you know, the time to stand up to the president is when the president says something like, when he makes a threat to send law enforcement to polling places, that's when the Attorney General has to firmly and publicly say, that will not happen, that violates the law. Silence is not an option, because whether or not troops are sent to polling places, just the threat to do so can be enough in some circumstances to chill the vote. If people believe that if they go to a polling place, you know, there's gonna be police there and I might get arrested if I look wrong. If I look like I don't belong there, they might cart me off. That might keep some people away from the polls. So the politicization of the Justice Department is something that it's not completely new, but it's been taken to such extremes now that it's dangerous. In fact, I saw General Barr on a talk show. I believe it was the Mark Levin show recently. I didn't see the show itself. I saw clips of it afterwards. And the entire show was essentially the Attorney General of the United States berating Democrats as not loving this country, as not supporting law enforcement. And it just sounded like a campaign event. When you have the Attorney General marching with the president while federal agents are tear gassing peaceful protesters, it sends a message that this is not an even-handed Justice Department. This is not a Justice Department that's doing anything but the will of the President of the United States. And because General Barr has taken these actions, by the way, he's now in the crosshairs of state bar associations. In fact, 4 past presidents of the DC Bar Association have filed a complaint with the DC Bar Association that he's violated his ethical rules as a prosecutor. I don't know what'll happen to that, but I do believe this is something as Democrats we have to steel ourselves and get ready for, and that is, I started to call it the October surprise, but it's sort of the no surprise October surprise. Because General Barr has all but said that he's appointed a special U.S. attorney named John Durham of Connecticut to look into the origins of the Russia investigation, and that he expects that report to come out before the election. So I fully expect that report to come out late September or October. I fully expect that it is intended to be a bombshell that helps Trump and or hurts Biden, probably both. And the only question I have is whether it will have the kind of effect in 2020 that James Comey's press conference our letter 10 days before the election did in 2016. I tend to think it won't have that same effect, because I think while in 2016, Comey still had a relatively untarnished reputation, I don't think that General Barr enjoys that at this point. But I'm fully expecting that to happen. And but if it does have that effect, it can have a devastating effect, because I don't know how many of y'all have read a report by Nate Silver, but Nate Silver is one of these numbers crunchers that, you know, one of these polling gurus, and he talks about the devastating effect that the Comey statement 10 days before the election that he had reopened the investigation of Hillary had, and what it did in the space of 24 hours in the poll of polls, not any single poll, but in the poll of polls. It took all the polls, added them up, weighted them. 10 days before the election, the only thing on voters' minds was the Access Hollywood tape, and Hillary is up about 6 points in the poll of polls. After Comey made his statement, that 6 points evaporated to 0. It was pick 'em. So in the space of one day, based upon that bombshell, you know, 6 points went by the boards. Now, the question is, if Barr Durham release something in October, as I said, will it have that same effect? I kind of think not, but I hope not. But I think we have to be braced for it. I think we have to be ready for it. And I think we have to be skeptical as we can be about what comes out. But I was fortunate. I worked for Janet Reno. And y'all might remember Janet Reno was not Bill Clinton's first choice for AG. In fact, she wasn't his second choice for AG. She was his third choice. And there was always kind of a healthy tension between President Clinton and General Reno. They weren't close. They worked together on legislation and things like that, but it was not the same kind of cover your back kind of thing. And I'll never forget when I was U.S. Attorney, Mary Claire was nice enough to mention the 3 books I've had published. There was a book I didn't get published, and I was working on a book with Henry Cisneros. And Henry Cisneros and I were working on a book for Simon & Schuster, and Bill Clinton got himself elected president. And Cisneros becomes Secretary of HUD, and I go on to be U.S. Attorney, and so the book never gets finished. It never gets completed. But I'm sitting in my office one day, and my prosecutor from Lubbock calls and says, "We've just had a lawyer come in and drop off tapes of Secretary Cisneros that he says are quite incriminating. What do I do with those?" I say, "Well, the first thing you do is get him to Washington, because I'm going to recuse myself, because I've known Henry Cisneros, and we actually had a book deal together." So I recused myself. They go to Washington, D.C., and Janet Reno recuses herself. So she was pretty quick to recuse herself on that when she felt the public would prefer to see somebody truly independent do the investigation. And I will say this, although I probably politically never agreed with anything Jeff Sessions did or said, when he recused himself, which led to Comey's appointment, that was the right call to make. Every prosecutor worth his salt will tell you that. But just to show you how different things are in the Justice Department now as opposed to then, I remember General Reno summoning the U.S. attorneys and saying, "We're getting ready to go into the election season, and I'm going to ask you, I don't know if I can order you, but I'm going to ask you not to attend political events, not to attend the political conventions. I know some of y'all love to go to those conventions, love to go to the political events, but it's too important. We have to enforce the Voting Rights Act. We have to enforce election laws. And it's important not only that you be nonpartisan, but that you appear to be nonpartisan." And so I think to a person, we abided by that rule and stayed away from political events. But the next Attorney General who comes in, and I'm going to wrap this up, has a big task ahead of himself or herself. and that is to restore morale at the Department of Justice, which is fair to say I've never seen it lower. A lot of good people have left. It's a great job. And as I said, there's going to be a lot of folks that are going to want to serve, but I think we've got to restore morale at the Department of Justice. Congress is going to have to provide greater protection for the inspector generals, because what President Trump has done is if an inspector general crosses him, he's fired him. You know, that's also unprecedented. We used to have to take our lumps from the IG when if we screwed up, the IG was going to do a report. Well, no more. They're no longer independent. So we've got to create greater independence. And I think we have to step back and take a look at what we do. Do we need some kind of independent counsel? Because as you said, as I mentioned, one of the hamstrings that Mueller operated under was he reported to and through the Department of Justice, which essentially allowed General Barr to squelch his report. Sit on it for 2 weeks, mischaracterize it. And that was different from the old independent counsel. Mueller was called special counsel, but both parties made a value choice to let the independent counsel law lapse. You got to remember, Bill Clinton got stung by the Starr report. You know, Reagan had Iran-Contra. And so both parties said, enough of this fun, and let it lapse. I think we need to take a look at whether we need something, you know, a true independent counsel situation to handle cases, for example, where the president has been alleged to break the law. So with that, you know, as I said, I will be happy to kind of entertain any questions. And
I have a question.
okay.
It's Carolyn Hockley. There has been so many entities of our government destroyed. How are we going to protect ourselves if the Democrats don't, I guess if the Democrats don't win? I'm fearful.
Well, I wish I could answer that question. I will say this, you know, we have one House now. So and I think the Democrats will either hold the House and perhaps even add to their margin in the House. But as it's clear, no matter how energetic Speaker Pelosi is, she can't get a bill through if Mitch McConnell's not going to, I mean, the Voting Rights Act is not going to go through as long as the Republicans hold the Senate. And frankly, even if the Democrats retook the Senate, they're not going to be able to override a presidential veto. So without the presidency, I mean, you're right. Inspector generals are at risk. EPA, I mean, you know, you could, I spent my time talking about the Justice Department because that's what I know the best. But you could have someone come and give you a report on the EPA and what it's doing and not doing. And we could probably go through Department of Education. Each department, you know, we're just going to have to rebuild and frankly, not just get good people in, but there's some people that need to be weeded out of those departments that they planted in those departments. One of the things the Republicans have done quite successfully is take over the judiciary. Trump's appointed more than 200 federal judges. Those are appointments for life. And by the way, one thing I didn't touch upon is if we could get rid of the electoral system, I'd be a happy man. Because if we elected our presidents like every other sane country in the world by popular vote, 7 out of the 9 Supreme Court justices would have been appointed by Democrats. You know, so we're, as someone said, we're like one 87-year-old woman who suffered 2 bouts of cancer and doesn't weigh 100 pounds. You know, she's all that stands between us and a court that's going to be controlled by the Republicans for the rest of our lives. So I guess you start department by department, but you're right. If we don't have the presidency, I don't know how you rebuild these. These departments that have been hollowed out.
Yeah.
Has there ever been an attorney general of comparable complicity with the president?
Well, of course, John Mitchell went to prison.
Well, there's
John
that.
Mitchell went to prison in Watergate, and he was, I would say, though, that in terms of the damage done to the department, Barr's done more damage. And part of it was there were many people, myself included, that frankly, when he came on board, thought, well, here's someone that had served in a prior administration. I seriously thought he's not going to last a year. He's going to cross Trump, and Trump's going to get rid of him. And, you know, what can I say? I was wrong. I was just dead wrong. But I would say Mitchell, who wound up in prison, is the only one that's in my lifetime, certainly, that's been comparable to him.
I read somewhere that Barr has a belief in a unitary theory of government, which would give great precedence to the president. Is that an atypical attitude for an attorney general?
Yes. As I said, as attorney general, you don't work for the president. President has a lot of lawyers who work for him. They're called, White House counsel, and they work in the White House. In fact, one of my law partners, Harriet Myers, was White House counsel for George W. Bush. So he's got his own lawyers. And a president can have White House counsel. He can have personal counsel. But the attorney general's counsel for the people. And so I don't, and I've heard this, his theory before about the unitary, that whatever, it's essentially what Nixon said. If the president does it, that makes it legal. No, it doesn't. If the president withholds, hello, Carl, if the president withholds his tax returns despite a lawful subpoena from a House committee to get them, that doesn't make it legal. I mean, you might have trouble enforcing it. And you are going to have trouble enforcing it if the Secretary of Treasury won't turn it over and the Attorney General won't enforce the law. But we've, but that doesn't make it legal.
Doesn't seem to matter.
Well, it kind of doesn't, but maybe in the long run it will. Because as I said, there may be consequences. And I mentioned the bar associations. They're looking into General Barr and whether he's violated his ethical rules as a prosecutor. You have a duty of candor as a prosecutor, certainly candor to the court. And we've got a judge, by the way, the judge in the Flynn case, he's not buying it. They floated this, tried to intervene in this case, as I said, at a late and unheard of stage. And they've given the flimsiest, I'd say almost a laughable pretext for doing it, and the judge isn't buying it. So let's just see where this ends up. And I think, look, there's going to be a new attorney. If Biden, there's going to be a new attorney general. There's going to be a new sheriff in town. And, some of these people who have made demonstrably false statements to legislative committees, guess what? The statute of limitations is 5 years. So, let's see how it plays out. Justice sometimes doesn't move fast, but, there may be some of these folks may pay consequences. Hey, Carl.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
It kind of draws on some of the one of the last things you mentioned. There are a lot of countries in the world. They tend to be in the developing world that, quite frankly, have endemic corruption, that have a tradition of not going after outgoing executives. And it's not necessarily because they're against the rule of law, but they have this very tricky balancing act that it's going to invite tit for tat prosecution when, quote, their side comes into power.
Yep.
That's just a reality. And so you have this balancing you have to do. And as you just mentioned, President Trump and people in his administration very well might have legal jeopardy that outlast his term in office. And so we as a country are going to have that unfortunate conversation with ourselves about balancing the principles of the rule of law and that no person is above the law with the consequence that upholding that principle very well will invite retaliation after election cycle and further politicize the criminal justice system. Do you have any observations on how we as a nation are going to end up facing that question?
And I think what you describe is absolutely in the minds of people when they come into a new administration. I think it was in the minds of Obama when he came in, and you know, that, you know, like you said, we could create a precedent that could come back to bite us in the ass, you know, here. And sure enough, by the way, you know, Regina, my wife, was in the White House when Clinton extended the special counsel, the Independent Counsel Act that was used against him with Starr. And the White House counsel at the time was telling him, don't do that. You're making a mistake. Don't sign that. Oh, don't worry about it. I'm going to do it. And he did it. And of course, Ken Starr got appointed and they were off to the races. Carl, it's obviously going to be I think the hardest challenge that the next Attorney General is going to have to face. Now, and that is, do we as a Justice Department, or how vigorous are we in looking into President Trump, his family, his Confederates, all these people who, you know, arguably have run afoul of the law? I personally think the Justice Department really can't turn a complete blind eye to this and just pretend it didn't happen. This is not normal. This is not policy difference. I mean, if what we have seen, and by the way, the case may have nothing to do with Trump's time as prosecutor. It may have everything to do with taxes, tax evasion. It may have everything to do with money laundering. It may have everything to do with bank fraud that you would prosecute in a heartbeat out of the Southern District of New York if it's anyone but the president. So, you know, if it's going to be somebody that's either the president or his close family, my guess is a prosecutor is going to want a high degree of confidence in the evidence, a high degree of confidence that a jury is going to find guilt here. But I think they will probably end up proceeding because it's so rampant and it's so different from, I mean, we just never, you know, not since Nixon have we had a president that refused to turn over his tax returns. Now, there's a reason for that. I mean, that's just, you know, there's a reason those aren't coming forward. And I think the reason to a prosecutor seems pretty simple, and that is you take the tax returns and you take what he's turning over to the banks when he wants to look flush and what he just tells the IRS when he wants to look broke. At the same time, they don't mesh. Well, it's sort of like I said before, are you lying here? Or are you lying there? That's the way a lot of bank fraud cases, that's the way a lot of tax fraud cases get made. So I think probably it's not going to take the cleverest of prosecutors to see a pattern of wrongdoing here that'll be pursued. And oh, by the way, there are state prosecutors that appear willing to wade into that water now. And so while President Trump leaving office, because this is something we also have to anticipate, he could pardon himself, pardon his family, pardon, you know, Tom, Dick, and Harry, who did business with him. And we may be stuck with those pardons, but state prosecutors are not stuck with those pardons. And New York is blessed not only with a very aggressive U.S. attorney, with a very aggressive attorney general and a very aggressive Manhattan District Attorney's Office. And so Trump, you know, Trump may meet his match with the state prosecutors before he does with the federal prosecutors.
I have
This
a
is a-
question.
Mhm.
Go ahead. Go ahead with your question.
Yes. I have a question about, you mentioned the Electoral College earlier.
Yeah.
If we did away with the Electoral College, which I am in favor of also because my vote here in Texas is not very well counted.
Me too.
If you go back and look at the 2016 election, nobody got 51% of the majority of the vote. Can we live with a president who gets less than a majority of the popular vote?
I think we have. You know, when you look back at, you know, Lincoln or certainly Clinton, you know, we've had presidents that have had less than a majority vote. Now, you know, you do raise an interesting point, which would be, we don't have a system like it where you have 20 political parties, serious political parties running. We have two, and then we generally have, you know, some fringe candidates out there as well. But I would be anxious to get rid of the Electoral College just because, like you said, being in Texas, certainly for the past 20 or 30 years, they don't campaign here. They don't spend money here. Same in California, same in New York, you know. States that are sort of written off as either red or blue, it doesn't make the difference to the Electoral College whether you lose Texas by 1 vote or whether you lose Texas by 1 million votes. It just makes no difference. And so if you're going to lose, but you know, if you're going to lose it anyway, lose big. That's the moral of the story. And I just think you spend all your time. It always comes down to this, doesn't it? There's 6 or 7 states that the candidates spend all their time and all their money and all their effort on because they're the states that people think are really at play. It's going to be what? North Carolina and Georgia and maybe Arizona. I mean, it's states like, I grew up in New Mexico. New Mexico, this tiny little state, you know, with maybe 1.5 million people, 2 million people total. It's going to get more play than Texas because it's purple. It'll go both ways. So I just think you get rid of the Electoral College for that reason. I worry a lot about, you know, the Democrats because, as people say, we have to win big to win. And with the voter suppression that will inevitably happen, with already casting doubt on the election, you know, I do, and it looks like it's not snowballing, but you know, the sort of the cynical idea of getting Kanye West to you know, on the ballot in some of the purple states in the hopes that he would siphon off 1 or 2% of the African-American vote. Very cynical. Nobody expects him to win. Nobody expects him to come close to winning. But, you know, in a close race, 1 or 2% can make the difference. You know, I'll give you a perfect example. Jill Stein. In those 3 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the 3 states, the sort of Hillary lost by 77,000 votes total. Jill Stein got more votes in each of those states than Hillary lost by. So a third-party candidate can really gum up the works, and you know, you do reach a state. Maybe to get around your point, maybe you start thinking about a rule that if nobody gets 50%, the top 2 go at it again. If you start having 7 candidates, you know, serious candidates, and nobody gets more than 30% of the vote.
I was curious, when you talked about voter suppression, why do you think Greg Abbott extended our early voting by a week? Seems counterintuitive.
I have no clue. I saw that too, and I thought, really? Okay, we'll take it, you know. But you know, I'm not sure why he did it. It is counter. It's counter to what we usually see. In fact, it's counter to what we usually see from Austin, which is to shorten early voting, which is to close polling places. I do think it was very interesting because, you know, President Trump has blasted mail-in voting. I mean, he basically said, even though he votes by mail, he doesn't want anyone else to. but somebody got to him and told him, you know what? You're going to lose Florida unless you get a big mail-in vote. And so he's amended his statement now to say mail-in voting is bad in every state but Florida. Florida knows how to handle it really well. So he's all for mail-in voting in Florida, but in no other state, which I thought, you know, how inconsistent and hypocritical can you be? Because if there's one state that's going to screw it up, let's face it, it's Florida. We've been there and done that.
Oh, I've got a question.
Yeah.
Yes, so with Trump all concerned about voter fraud, now voter fraud is something that can happen on both sides. So how does he know that this voter fraud that he's worried about actually won't benefit him?
Well, I think, you know, it's not voter fraud that like I said, Keith, I think it's voter suppression that I would worry about. I mean, the instance of voter fraud, you know, according to every study I've ever read, you know, is so minuscule that, you know, you really can't find an election where you can point to and say, yeah, this was turned by voter fraud. You can point to elections that were lost by voter suppression. And that's by, you know, preventing people from getting to the polls. That's by closing polling places. That's by not having enough polling workers and machines in certain neighborhoods. But yeah, I mean, actual voter fraud where somebody votes who's not entitled to vote, that's just, I mean, they set up a commission. You might remember the Trump administration did, and they put, of all people in charge of it, was that Chris Kobach, the guy that just lost in Kansas. And they never published a report. They were supposed to come out with some damning study about how voter fraud was rampant, and, you know, and obviously they're going to point the finger at the Democrats. They just couldn't come up with anything that would stand the light of day, and they never released. They disbanded without releasing a report. So it depends on what you mean by voter fraud. If you mean voter suppression, does that happen? Yeah, that happens. People voting, and by the way, most cases of voting fraud, you know what they turn out to be? People going to the wrong precinct. People going to the wrong precinct. Or they had a recent case, I want to say Wisconsin, but don't hold me to that. It was a recent state, and Trump made some statement about it, that they'd found like 800 cases of voter fraud. Was it? Where was it? Okay. So they looked into each one of those cases, and you know what they turned out to be? People who voted early and died before the election.
Oh.
And I didn't know this, but
so that's where they get the idea of dead people voting.
Yeah, and I didn't know this. I guess if you vote early and you die before the election, your vote doesn't get counted.
Really?
I thought they counted, you know, in your memorial vote. But evidently those were the kind of things. We had that very famous case over in Fort Worth, as you probably remember, which I'm still scratching my head over. A woman was on probation, and she was an African-American woman, I believe, who voted for Trump. And she believed because she was on probation, she was entitled to vote. And she gets charged with voter fraud and gets sentenced to some humongous sentence, like 5 years. I mean, it's just unbelievable miscarriage of justice. I actually knew the lawyer, Carl, you do too, Tom Leatherberry, who took her case, and I think they were unsuccessful. I mean, in terms of getting her out. But I mean, the thought that a woman who thought she was entitled to vote because she was on probation gets not only charged by the DA, but sentenced and sent to prison on a 5-year sentence, just to me boggles the mind. I mean, that's to me unbelievable of the prosecutor to bring that case and the judge to sentence it.
You can't vote if you're on like probation for a class B or A misdemeanor?
I don't know what her probation was, but whatever it was, she was on probation. She was not entitled to vote.
And what state was it?
To Texas.
And you're saying probation, not parole.
I'm pretty sure it's I thought it was probation.
You have
You
to be
lose
off
the right
paper.
to vote when you have a probated sentence?
In the federal system, you lose your right to vote, period.
But that's a felony, though.
Yeah.
That's not a class A or B misdemeanor.
Oh, I don't know that she was on a misdemeanor. I think she might have been a felon.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. I don't know what her underlying offense was.
Probably a felony.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
I'm guessing a
Yeah.
felony at some time.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions for Paul?
One last question, please.
Sure.
Earlier, you were also talking about the Trump threatening to send law enforcement out to the polling places.
Yep.
If that happens, isn't that voter intimidation, and can citizens affect an arrest of that person?
I would say yes, it's voter suppression. I would not advise you to go arrest him. I would not advise that, for your health and for, I mean, what I would advise you to do, frankly, is do what these people are doing, which is whip out your phone, get it on camera. There's going to be attorneys who are going to be working. There's going to be Democratic attorneys. There'll be Republican attorneys too. The Democratic attorneys are going to be working. Get it to those lawyers. Let them get it to a judge. I really, I would worry about your physical safety and your health by trying to affect citizens' arrest of someone in law enforcement who carries.
I'll just stay with my mail-in vote.
Yeah, I'd stick with mail-in, but I'll tell you what, if you do see that happening, I wish people would get it on film and get their cameras out, record it. There'll be lawyers working. I'm going to probably be one of those lawyers working election day, and we'll do what we can. It's definitely, I think, intended to send a chill. This is before Carl Ginsburg's time as a judge. He won't remember this, but there's a very fine federal judge named Sid Fitzwater. And when he was a very young state judge, like I'm 28 or 29, really young, the head judge had people go out and put signs, had all the judges go out, put signs in front of the polling places, basically, it's a crime, you'll go to jail if you vote in the wrong place, and do all that stuff. Well, Judge Fitzwater did it, regretted it, and it almost held up his nomination to the federal bench, but he had enough people that vouched for him and said, look, that happened to him like on day one of his job. He realized it was a mistake. He's sorry for it. And I will say this, he was the most careful, cautious, fair-minded judge from that point on that I've ever been in front of, I think. But yeah, I know there's been all sorts of efforts, but in the past to intimidate voters by signs, by having law enforcement there. That's why you're not allowed to do it. That's why, Trump can't do it. And that's why we need an attorney general who says, no, you can't do that, Mr. President. You may want to do it, but I'm the attorney general and I don't represent you. I represent the people of the United States. And they've decided we're not going to do that.
Thank you.
Mary,
Thank
can I
you.
ask the question? Oh.
Who has the question?
Oh, Letty, I just have a question. I know there was a final question already, but with everything that we've seen happen with this administration in these 3 years, or in this first term, what do you see that they would do if he won?
Okay.
Next 4 years? I mean, they're pretty serious. They're very aggressive. I mean, with everything that they've done, what do you see that they'll do?
You mean if Trump wins?
Yes.
Wow. I would say, given the fact that he's, if he won, I can't, it boggles the mind what he could do more, I would say get rid of all the inspector generals who weren't appointed by him. He would control the Supreme Court, almost certainly, with 4 more years. He'd have at least 1 and maybe 2 appointments. So the Supreme Court would be theirs for probably 20 or 30 years. He's already appointed more than 200 federal judges. They're mostly young. Almost all of them come out of the Federalist Society, mostly white male, you know. So I think they would remake the judiciary. And I just think you'd further degrade. We talked about rebuilding morale in a lot of these departments and attracting good people to come to these departments like justice and EPA and all these really important jobs in our government. It just wouldn't happen. I mean, one of the biggest jokes in the administration is infrastructure week. We haven't been spending the money on infrastructure that needs to be spent. I mean, you can probably criticize any president for this, but you look at a president like Obama and even George W. Bush. Let me give credit where credit's due. Bush read a book that scared the bejesus out of him about pandemics and decided, you know, we gotta have a pandemic response ready because it's gonna hit this country. And he became sort of a preacher for that. So all the mistakes W made, that wasn't one of them. He said, we got to have a pandemic response. And you know what? Obama and Biden built one. They built a dang good one. And Trump got rid of them when he got in. They weren't his people. He didn't care. And we're paying the price for that. So you asked what he would do. He'd do what he does now. He'd play golf and he'd watch Fox News. And that would be about it.
And he too.
What's that?
No, this is Lisa Donaldrop also spends his time tweeting.
Spends all his time tweeting.
Yes. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. He is an avid tweeter. I will give him that.
Well, listen, Paul, I really want to thank everyone for coming, but I really want to thank you for sharing all of these, your expertise, your thoughts, your perspective. It was really a wonderful opportunity to pick your brain and to hear it's so depressing, but it's good to understand the enemy.
Well, we've got a couple of months, so y'all get out there and do your duty.
Yes, and we have local candidates, Julie Johnson and Michelle Beckley.
Right.
Because holding on to what we have and gaining more seats in the Texas legislature is very important, because Texas is, if we can harness the power of Texas, we can also start to move things around. But the presidency is, this year the presidency is definitely the thing.
And the Senate, yeah. But
and the Senate, of course, yes.
Of course, they've gotten rid of, as you know, straight ballot voting. So you got to go all the way down.
Yes. And we have to remind people of that they have to vote all the way down, because Absolutely. One of the things that strengthens our party in Dallas County is the fact that we have so many office holders all the way down through the judiciary.
Yeah.
So we need to vote, and those are going to be way at the bottom. And then there'll still be some municipal seats, joint election, the school boards and the city council at the end. So it's going to be a very long ballot. And those are nonpartisan, but they're partisan, even though they say they're nonpartisan. They're very partisan. So it's important to pay attention. It's important to pay attention and vote all the way down. And again, we have signs available, Biden-Harris signs, although mine was stolen the first day I put it up. So next one's going up coated with vegetable oil and honey. So if you want them, contact, through the club or me. And then again, Paul, I can't thank you enough. And I hope everyone will go out and consider buying his book. Legal thrillers are always pretty fun. And
exactly. Good for a pandemic.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And all be safe and take care. This is our first Zoom meeting. This first meeting we had since February. So I'm pretty happy with it myself.
Thank you very much, Mary. Really appreciate it.
Thank Paul. Thank Paul, and thanks Stephen.
Thank y'all.
Thanks Stephen for making this possible, because it was his idea and he set it all up for us.
Yeah.
Do this again.
He was the
I want to thank you. I want to thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Paul.
And all of you be safe, okay? Everyone be safe and stay well.
Whoa. Will this be
Thank you.
available after, I see the recording light is on. Is this going to be available in archive?
I am going to make that available to you, Mary Claire. We'll put it in
Oh,
Dropbox.
wonderful.
Get it to
Somebody
you.
asked me about that. That's wonderful. I didn't
Yeah,
even
this-
think to. Oh,
so-
you're an angel. You're so smart.
I hang around with smart people.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Well, everyone, take care, and we may try this again. Thank you. And keep, our candidates, Michelle Beckley in Denton County, Julie Johnson here, and of course, MJ Hager. And, just help them, and, keep working and contributing where you can, because that's phone bank. Yeah. And I talked to somebody at the Democratic Party downtown, and they'd register 100 voters this weekend. So, there's a lot of efforts ongoing. And even just buying the signs are $10, but that's money that goes to the party. It's a donation. So every little bit counts, because we have a very powerful enemy arrayed against us right now. So thank you all, and have a great evening, and all be safe. And hey, well, how are you?
Thank
I don't
you.
have a chance to visit everybody, but all take care. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye, Kurt. Take care.
Thanks, Mary Claire.
Oh, you're always welcome. You take care.
Great job. Great meeting.
Always great. Paul, thank you again.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye, Alyssa.